The city had long since turned cold by the time Marcus Aldridge stepped out of the glass tower that bore his family's name in sleek chrome letters 40 stories high. The board meeting had stretched past midnight. Another negotiation. Another merger. Another carefully orchestrated victory that left him feeling nothing but the dull throb behind his temples. He loosened his tie as the valet brought his car around. A black sedan whose understatement cost more than most people earned in a year. Marcus didn't drive it for the luxury. He drove it because it was forgettable, because it allowed him to move through the world without being seen. Tonight, he chose the service route. The main boulevard would still be crawling with late-night traffic, photographers lingering outside hotel lobbies, the kind of attention he'd spent the last decade learning to avoid. The narrow street behind the financial district was quieter, darker, lined with shuttered storefronts and the skeletal remains of scaffolding from buildings that would never quite finish their renovations. He preferred it this way, empty, utilitarian, honest in its neglect. He was 3 blocks in when he saw her. At first, she was just a shape against the dim glow of a street lamp, small and stationary in a way that didn't belong. Marcus slowed the car instinctively, his eyes narrowing as the figure came into focus. A child. Maybe 6, maybe 7. She stood near the entrance of a closed convenience store, her yellow coat too bright against the gray concrete, a green backpack slung over one shoulder. She wasn't crying. She wasn't looking around frantically. She was simply standing there, hands folded in front of her, watching the empty street with an eerie patience that made something tighten in Marcus's chest. His first thought was irritation. Not again. He'd seen this before. Staged encounters, elaborate setups designed to catch him off guard, to extract money or sympathy or a photograph that could be sold to the highest bidder. People used children for this. He knew that. He'd been warned about it by his lawyers, his security team, his carefully curated circle of advisors who understood that men like him were targets. But as he sat there, engine idling, the girl didn't move. She didn't glance toward the car. She didn't reach out or call for help. She simply stood, small and impossibly still, as if she were waiting for something that might never come. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his phone in his pocket. He should call security. That was the protocol. Let someone else handle it. Someone trained, someone whose compassion hadn't been calcified by years of distrust. He could drive away and forget he'd ever seen her. He could let the city swallow this moment the way it swallowed everything else. But he didn't move. There was something about her composure that unsettled him. Children weren't supposed to be this calm. They were supposed to be frightened, vulnerable, loud in their need. This girl was none of those things. She was quiet in a way that spoke of something deeper, something Marcus recognized but couldn't name. It reminded him of himself at board meetings, the deliberate stillness, the refusal to show weakness, the careful management of emotion that made other people uncomfortable. He pulled the car to the curb and lowered the window halfway, keeping the distance between them intentional. The air that slipped inside was sharp and cold, carrying the faint smell of rain-soaked asphalt and something else. Something sweeter, like the remnants of a bakery that had closed hours ago. "Are you lost?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, edged with the exhaustion he'd been carrying all night. The girl turned her head slowly, and for the first time Marcus saw her face clearly. Round cheeks, dark eyes that held no fear, just a quiet assessment. She looked at him the way people looked at him in boardrooms, measuring, considering, deciding whether he was worth her time. "Are you lost too?" she asked. The question landed like a physical blow. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, to correct her, to explain that he wasn't lost, that he knew exactly where he was going, that he had a home and a life and a carefully constructed identity that left no room for confusion. But the words didn't come. Instead, he sat there, frozen behind the wheel of his expensive, forgettable car, staring at a child who had somehow seen straight through him. He should leave. He should call someone. He should do anything other than sit here, letting the stranger's question unravel something he'd spent years keeping tightly bound. But the girl was still watching him, patient and still, as if she had all the time in the world, as if she already knew the answer before he did. Marcus realized, with a slow and uncomfortable clarity, that he didn't know what to say. And worse, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the authority that had somehow slipped away in the space between her question and his silence. He straightened in his seat, fingers tightening on the steering wheel as if the leather could anchor him back to familiar ground. This was a simple problem. Problems had solutions. He solved problems for a living, multimillion-dollar acquisitions, hostile takeovers, negotiations that could reshape entire industries. A lost child should have been the easiest thing in the world to manage. "Where are your parents?" he asked, keeping his voice level professional. The tone he used when addressing junior executives who needed direction without coddling. The girl tilted her head slightly, considering his question with the same measured patience she'd shown before. Her yellow coat caught the streetlight, making her seem almost luminous against the darkened storefronts behind her. She didn't answer immediately, and Marcus found himself waiting in a way he rarely waited for anyone. "I asked first," she said finally, her voice soft but unwavering. The statement hung between them like a challenge wrapped in innocence. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite amusement, but something uncomfortable that lived in the space between the two. She wasn't being defiant. She was simply refusing to let him redirect the conversation, to turn her observation into something manageable and ordinary. "Are you lost too?" The question echoed in his mind, insistent and unwelcome. He wanted to dismiss it, to explain that there was a fundamental difference between being lost and simply choosing an alternate route home. But the distinction felt hollow even as he tried to construct it. He thought about the board meeting he'd just left, the carefully rehearsed talking points, the performance of certainty he'd perfected over years of pretending he knew exactly where he was going. He thought about the empty penthouse waiting for him across town, all glass and steel and expensive silence. He thought about the last time someone had asked him a question that wasn't transactional, that didn't want something from him beyond the answer itself. "I'm not lost," he said. But the words came out quieter than he intended, almost defensive. The girl nodded as if she'd expected that response, as if she'd heard it before from other people who were trying to convince themselves of the same thing. She shifted her backpack higher on her shoulder, a small gesture that reminded Marcus she was still a child, still small enough that the world probably felt too big most of the time. He tried again, pulling himself back to the practical framework that had always served him well. "Do you have an address? A phone number? Someone I can call?" She looked past him, down the empty street where shadows pooled between streetlights, and the distant hum of traffic felt like it belonged to another city entirely. "I know where I'm supposed to be," she said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone who'd learned that language could be both shield and weapon. "But I don't know if they know where I am." It wasn't an answer. It was something more complicated, an admission wrapped in logic, a statement that revealed more about her understanding of absence than any simple explanation could have offered. Marcus recognized the deflection immediately. He'd built a career on saying things that sounded like answers without actually committing to anything specific. He should call the police. That was the correct procedure. Hand this over to people whose job it was to reunite lost children with frantic parents. But something about the girl's composure made him hesitate. She didn't seem frightened. She didn't seem abandoned in the way he'd expect a truly lost child to seem. She seemed like she was waiting, not for rescue, but for something else, something she couldn't quite name. Marcus made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. "There's a busier street 2 blocks from here. Better lighting, more people. I'll walk you there, and we can figure out next steps." He paused, aware of how this might look, how every interaction he had existed in a minefield of perception and liability. "I'll stay visible. You stay ahead of me. We'll keep distance." The girl nodded, accepting the terms without question, and started walking. Marcus stepped out of the car, leaving it running at the curb, another calculated risk, but one that felt minor compared to everything else about this moment. He followed several paces behind, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough that anyone watching would see appropriate boundaries being maintained. The night air was colder than he'd realized, cutting through his expensive suit jacket like it was nothing. His dress shoes echoed against the pavement, each step a reminder of how far removed he was from this kind of situation. The girl's sneakers made almost no sound. She walked with purpose, her small frame somehow commanding the empty street in a way that made Marcus feel like the uncertain one. He watched her yellow coat moving ahead of him, a bright point in the darkness, and felt the uncomfortable weight of her question settling deeper into his chest. Are you lost too? Not lost, just displaced, just choosing alternate routes, just managing the optics of a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt increasingly hollow from within. The girl glanced back once, checking that he was still there, and for a brief moment their eyes met. She didn't smile, neither did he, but something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that they were both pretending to know exactly where they were going. The busier street revealed itself gradually, first as ambient light bleeding around the corner, then as the muted sounds of late-night commerce, and finally as the full tableau of a neighborhood that hadn't quite gone to sleep. A convenience store glowed with fluorescent certainty, its windows plastered with advertisements for lottery tickets and energy drinks. A few pedestrians moved along the sidewalk with the weary determination of people finishing night shifts or starting impossibly early mornings. Marcus felt the shift immediately, the way exposure always made his skin prickle with awareness. He was visible now. They both were. The girl had slowed her pace as they approached the intersection, and Marcus realized with uncomfortable clarity that the careful distance he'd maintained between them had collapsed without his noticing. She drifted closer, drawn perhaps by instinct or simply by the logic that strangers on bright streets were more threatening than the one she'd already deemed safe enough to follow. She stood now barely 3 feet from him, small and trusting in a way that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. A woman exiting the convenience store noticed them first. She was middle-aged, wearing scrubs beneath a heavy jacket, her face showing the particular exhaustion that came from caring for other people's problems all day. Her eyes moved from the girl to Marcus, and he watched the calculation happen in real time. The assessment, the suspicion, the maternal alarm that transformed her fatigue into sharp attention. She stopped walking. Her hand moved toward her phone. Marcus understood immediately what she was seeing. A man in an expensive suit, alone with a child who clearly wasn't his, on a street corner after midnight. The optics were catastrophic. It didn't matter that he'd been trying to help. It didn't matter that every decision he'd made had been designed to maintain appropriate boundaries. What mattered was the story that presented itself in a single glance, the narrative that required no additional context to feel complete and damning. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture of non-threat that felt absurd even as he performed it. I found her alone, he said, keeping his voice calm and clear, the same tone he used when addressing shareholders during crises. I'm trying to help her find her parents. The woman's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened with the particular righteousness of someone who believed they were witnessing something that needed intervention. She looked at the girl, who had moved even closer to Marcus, her small hand now gripping the edge of his suit jacket in a way that both touched and terrified him. Honey, the woman said, addressing the girl with exaggerated gentleness. Do you know this man? The girl looked up at Marcus, then back at the woman. He asked if I was lost, she said simply, as if this explained everything, as if the act of acknowledging displacement created some kind of bond that transcended the usual rules about strangers. Behind them, Marcus heard the convenience store door chime again. A man emerged, the shop owner, perhaps, or someone who'd been watching through the window. He was older, heavy-set, with the territorial protectiveness of someone who'd learned to read trouble before it fully materialized. He positioned himself near the woman, a silent alliance forming against the well-dressed stranger whose presence suddenly felt less like help and more like invasion. Marcus's phone felt heavy in his pocket. He should have called earlier. He should have established official channels before entering public space, before allowing himself to become part of a scene that could be photographed, recorded, misunderstood in ways that would follow him long after tonight ended. He pulled out his phone slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see exactly what he was doing. I'm calling the non-emergency line, he announced, directing his words to the woman and the shop owner as much as to the girl. To report a minor who appears to be separated from her guardians. He made the call with everyone watching, explaining the situation to the dispatcher with clinical precision while the girl continued to hold onto his jacket. The dispatcher asked for their location, asked if the child appeared to be in distress, asked if Marcus felt the situation was safe. He answered each question aware that his responses were being overheard, that every word was being evaluated by an audience that had already decided what kind of man he was. The dispatcher instructed him to wait in a public, well-lit location. Police would arrive within 20 minutes to take a report and attempt to locate the child's parents. Marcus thanked her and ended the call, then looked at the convenience store with its bright windows and security cameras pointed at every angle. "We'll wait inside," he said, addressing everyone and no one, "where there are cameras, where everything is documented." The shop owner nodded slowly, suspicion giving way to grudging approval of the logic. The woman in scrubs hesitated, then pulled out her own phone, likely texting someone about what she'd witnessed, creating her own record of the night. Marcus guided the girl toward the store entrance, careful not to touch her, aware that the hand still gripping his jacket belonged to her choice, not his. Inside, the fluorescent lights were unforgiving, bleaching everything of warmth and shadow. Marcus positioned them near the front window where they would be visible from the street, where every moment would be captured by the lens mounted above the register. The girl finally released his jacket and sat down on the floor near the magazine rack, her yellow coat bright against the scuffed linoleum, her composure unshaken by the scrutiny they'd just endured. Marcus remained standing, watching the street through the window, waiting for sirens that would bring both relief and complication. He couldn't simply hand her off, he realized. Couldn't just transfer this responsibility to authorities and walk away clean. Something had shifted when she'd chosen to trust him, when she'd held onto his jacket like it was an anchor in a world that kept moving too fast. He looked down at her, small and patient and impossibly calm, and understood that he'd already become part of whatever story her life was telling, whether he wanted to be or not. The police arrived in a single patrol car, no sirens, no urgency that would draw additional attention beyond what the scene had already accumulated. 2 officers emerged, one older with the weathered face of someone who'd seen versions of this situation 1,000 times before, the other younger and more alert, his hand resting near his belt with practiced casualness. They approached the convenience store with the measured pace of professionals assessing risk before fully committing to engagement. Marcus watched them through the window, aware of the exact moment when recognition flickered across the older officer's face. Not recognition of Marcus personally, they'd never met, but recognition of what he represented. The suit that cost more than a month's salary. The posture that spoke of boardrooms and country clubs. The particular kind of composure that came from knowing, on some fundamental level, that the world bent differently for people like him. The shift in tone was immediate and infuriating. "Mr. Aldridge," the older officer said as they entered, his voice carrying a deference that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with caution. "We appreciate you waiting with the child. Can you walk us through what happened?" Marcus provided the facts with the same clinical precision he'd used with the dispatcher, the time, the location, the circumstances of their meeting. He was careful to emphasize his attempts at maintaining distance, at following proper procedure, at doing everything a responsible citizen should do when encountering a child alone at night. The officers listened with expressions that suggested they were hearing both his words and the subtext beneath them, the unspoken calculation about liability and public relations that governed interactions like these. They didn't ask him to empty his pockets. They didn't request identification beyond confirming his name. They didn't question his story with anything approaching real scrutiny. The younger officer took notes while stealing glances at Marcus's watch, an understated piece that probably cost more than the patrol car idling outside. The older officer kept his questions polite, almost apologetic, as if investigating potential wrongdoing might somehow offend a man whose lawyers could make entire departments very uncomfortable. Marcus hated it. Hated the careful dance, the implicit acknowledgement that money had already determined the shape of this conversation. He thought about the woman in scrubs, the shop owner, the suspicion that had been so immediate and unforgiving. They'd seen him as a threat because the situation looked threatening. The officers saw him as something else entirely. Someone to be handled with care, someone whose version of events carried weight simply because of who he was. The girl sat quietly through the questioning, her yellow coat now slightly rumpled. Her green backpack still strapped to her shoulders like she might need to leave at any moment. When the officers finally addressed her, their voices shifted into the exaggerated gentleness adults used with children they assumed were fragile or frightened. She answered their questions with the same measured patience she'd shown Marcus, offering fragments that felt complete to her but read as evasive to anyone looking for a clean narrative. "What's your name?" "Emma." "Where do you live?" "In the city." "Where are your parents?" "Working, probably." "Do you have a phone number we can call?" "I don't remember numbers very well." Each answer was technically responsive but functionally incomplete, and Marcus watched the officers exchange glances that suggested this was going to be more complicated than a simple reunion. The older officer made a call, his voice low as he requested a social worker from Child Protective Services. "Standard procedure," he explained when he returned, "nothing to be concerned about, but they needed someone trained in these situations to assess next steps." Marcus felt his phone vibrate and knew before checking that his world was beginning to intrude. His assistant had protocols for when he went dark, systems designed to ensure nothing went wrong when he was unreachable. 3 missed calls would trigger a GPS check. 5 would initiate a security response. He'd blown past both thresholds. Within minutes, his driver arrived in the town car, followed shortly by his assistant, a sharp woman in her 40s named Patricia who managed crises with the efficiency of someone who understood that every problem was solvable if you had sufficient resources and leverage. She assessed the scene immediately, her eyes moving from Marcus to the girl to the officers to the growing number of phones being raised by passersby who'd recognized either Marcus or the spectacle of wealth intersecting with something that looked like scandal. "We should go," Patricia said quietly, positioning herself between Marcus and the nearest phone camera. "My team will coordinate with authorities. They'll ensure the child is cared for appropriately. Your continued presence here is creating complications." She was right, of course. She was always right about these things. Marcus's involvement had already transformed a simple situation into something newsworthy. The photos being taken would be online within hours, the millionaire and the mysterious child, the narrative already writing itself in ways that would require expensive damage control and carefully crafted statements. The smart choice, the strategic choice, was to extract himself immediately, to let institutions handle what they were designed to handle while he returned to the insulated world where consequences could be managed through lawyers and publicists. He looked at the girl, Emma, though the name felt incomplete, like it was protecting something more complicated underneath. She was watching him with those same dark, patient eyes, not pleading, not asking for anything, just observing what he would choose to do next. "Are you lost too?" The question wouldn't leave him alone. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, a weight that had nothing to do with the girl herself and everything to do with what she'd recognized in him during a moment when his carefully constructed defenses had been too tired to function properly. "I'm staying," Marcus said, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised Patricia. "Until we know she's safe. Until there's someone she trusts." Patricia's expression shifted through several emotions: frustration, concern, resignation, before settling into the professional acceptance of someone who knew when an argument was already lost. She nodded once, pulling out her phone to begin managing what could be managed, while Marcus moved back toward the magazine rack where Emma sat, still and watchful, waiting to see if the world would prove itself worthy of her quiet, devastating trust. The social worker arrived an hour later, carrying the particular exhaustion that came from witnessing too many broken systems and not enough solutions. Her name was Diane Reeves, and she wore her skepticism like armor, visible in the set of her jaw, the efficiency of her movements, the way her eyes tracked Marcus with the kind of assessment reserved for people she'd learned not to trust on principle. She'd seen his type before. Marcus understood immediately. The wealthy benefactor who swooped in during moments of crisis, seeking redemption or publicity or some complicated combination of both, only to disappear once the cameras stopped paying attention. She spoke with Emma first, crouching down to the girl's level near the magazine rack, her voice low enough that Marcus couldn't hear the specifics but could read the tone. Professional warmth layered over procedural necessity. Emma responded with the same fragmentary honesty that had characterized all her answers, offering pieces of truth that somehow never assembled into a complete picture. Diane's expression grew more concerned with each passing minute, and Marcus watched her make notes with the grim efficiency of someone documenting a problem that had no easy resolution. When she finally approached Marcus, her politeness was thin and transactional. "Mr. Aldridge, I appreciate your intervention tonight. The officers have your statement, and we have your contact information if we need follow-up. There's no reason for you to stay longer. We'll take it from here." It was dismissal dressed as gratitude, and Marcus recognized the subtext immediately. "Your involvement is noted. Your obligation is fulfilled. You can return to your life now and feel good about having done the right thing." He should have been relieved. He should have thanked her and walked out to where Patricia and the driver were waiting, should have let the machinery of social services do what it was designed to do while he returned to the problems that actually belonged to him. But Emma was watching him again, and there was something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not fear, not even sadness, but a kind of resigned understanding. The look of someone who'd learned early that people left, that promises were temporary, that the world kept moving regardless of whether you were ready for it to. "What happens to her tonight?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice neutral even as something uncomfortable twisted in his gut. Diane's expression suggested she'd been waiting for this question, that it confirmed something she'd already suspected about him. "She'll be placed in emergency foster care while we work to locate her guardians. Standard procedure for situations like this. She'll be safe, Mr. Aldridge. That's what matters." Safe. The word felt inadequate, insufficient to describe whatever Emma actually needed. But Marcus had no standing to argue, no authority beyond the money that had already shaped this interaction in ways he found distasteful. He nodded, exchanged final pleasantries with the officers, and allowed Patricia to guide him toward the exit. Emma didn't say goodbye. She simply watched him leave with the same calm patience she'd shown throughout the entire night, as if she'd expected this outcome, as if departure was just another thing that happened when you stayed still long enough. The town car felt suffocating after the fluorescent brightness of the convenience store. Patricia sat beside him, already typing on her phone, managing the narrative before it could manage them. "I've reached out to our media contacts. We're framing this as good citizenship. Successful businessman helps lost child, coordinates with authorities, demonstrates community responsibility. Clean, simple, nothing controversial." Marcus stared out the window at the city sliding past, all glass and steel and carefully cultivated anonymity. "She asked if I was lost too." Patricia paused her typing, glancing at him with the sharp intelligence that made her indispensable. "That's an unusual question for a child." "She's an unusual child. All the more reason to let professionals handle it, Marcus. Whatever her situation is, it's not something you can solve by writing a check or making a phone call." She softened slightly, her voice losing some of its professional edge. "You did the right thing. You got her to safety. That's where your responsibility ends." But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something suspended, incomplete, a story that had been interrupted before its natural conclusion. Marcus knew Patricia was right, knew that his continued involvement would create complications, would invite scrutiny into both his life and Emma's, would transform a good deed into something that could be weaponized by people who understood that perception mattered more than intention. He nodded anyway, accepting the logic even as he rejected its finality. The driver, James, who'd worked for Marcus for nearly a decade, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "That girl chose you, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with employment. "Not the other people on the street. Not the shop owner. You. Kids have instincts about these things. They know who sees them." Patricia shot James a look that suggested he was overstepping, but Marcus felt something shift at the words. Chosen. As if Emma's question hadn't been random, hadn't been the kind of thing a lost child might ask any stranger, but had been specific, targeted, the result of some assessment Marcus hadn't realized was happening. The penthouse was exactly as he'd left it. Immaculate, expensive, empty in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of furniture. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, still wearing his suit from the board meeting that felt like it had happened in another lifetime. His reflection stared back at him, a man who looked successful and certain and completely in control of his carefully constructed world. Are you lost too? The next morning, Marcus made a single phone call before his first meeting. He told himself it was due diligence, responsible follow-up, ensuring that the situation had been resolved appropriately. He told himself it had nothing to do with the weight in his chest, nothing to do with the way Emma's calm, patient face kept appearing in the spaces between his thoughts. The Child Welfare Office was cautious with their information, citing privacy concerns and protocol, but his name opened doors that would have remained closed to ordinary inquiries. Emma was in temporary placement. Attempts to locate her guardians were ongoing. The case had been flagged for additional review due to the inconsistencies in her story. Everything was being handled appropriately. Marcus thanked them and ended the call, staring at his phone as if it might provide answers to questions he hadn't learned how to ask yet. Across his desk, Patricia watched him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what he was thinking and exactly how dangerous it was. "Don't," she said simply. "Whatever you're considering, don't." But the word felt empty, unconvincing, a warning against something that had already begun the moment a small girl in a yellow coat had looked at him and seen something he'd spent years trying to hide. Marcus arrived at the Child Welfare Agency 3 days later carrying solutions wrapped in legal language and financial commitment. His attorney had prepared documents outlining potential support structures, educational trusts, temporary guardianship frameworks, funding for specialized services that the overburdened system couldn't provide on its standard budget. He'd also authorized a substantial donation to the agency itself, the kind of contribution that typically opened doors and generated gratitude and created the conditions where his suggestions might be received as collaborative rather than presumptuous. The reception area smelled of industrial cleaning solution and exhaustion, its walls decorated with children's drawings that were supposed to convey hope but mostly communicated the transience of the people who created them. Marcus waited in a plastic chair that wasn't designed for comfort, watching caseworkers move through the space with the hurried efficiency of people managing too many crises with too few resources. No one acknowledged his donation. No one seemed particularly impressed by his presence. Diane Reeves kept him waiting 40 minutes before calling him into her office, a small room stacked with file folders and dominated by a desk that had seen better decades. She didn't offer coffee or pleasantries. She gestured to a chair across from her and waited for him to sit before speaking. "Mr. Aldridge, I've reviewed the materials your attorney sent. The donation is generous and will genuinely help our programming. I want to be clear about that." She paused, and Marcus heard the approaching boundary before she articulated it. "But it doesn't change the parameters of Emma's case, and it doesn't grant you special access or influence over her placement." Marcus felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite frustration, but the particular discomfort of someone encountering resistance in a space where he'd expected cooperation. He'd spent decades learning how to navigate complex negotiations, how to identify leverage points and apply pressure with precision. Money opened conversations. Influence shaped outcomes. This was how the world functioned at his level. "I'm not trying to buy influence," he said, keeping his voice measured even as the words felt defensive. "I'm trying to provide resources that could improve her situation. Educational opportunities, therapeutic support, stability that the system can't always guarantee." Diane's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened with the particular righteousness of someone who'd heard versions of this speech too many times before. "What you're describing is control, Mr. Aldridge. You're describing a scenario where you determine what Emma needs and how those needs should be met, all wrapped in language about resources and stability. That's not help. That's replacement parenting by someone with no legal standing and no understanding of trauma-informed care." The words landed like physical blows, precise and unforgiving. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, to explain that she was mischaracterizing his intentions, that he genuinely wanted what was best for Emma without seeking to dominate her circumstances. But even as he constructed the argument, he recognized the truth embedded in Diane's assessment. He was trying to fix this the way he fixed everything, by identifying the problem, allocating resources, implementing solutions that could be measured and managed and controlled. "I encountered a child alone at night," Marcus said quietly, abandoning the prepared talking points. She asked me a question that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. I stayed when I could have left. I called when I could have forgotten. I'm here now because walking away feels like another kind of abandonment, and I've had enough practice at that to know what it costs. Diane studied him with an expression that suggested she was recalculating something, reassessing the shape of his presence in her office. Emma has agreed to a supervised visit. 15 minutes. You'll meet in our family room with a caseworker present. You will not make promises about her future. You will not offer money or gifts. You will not attempt to establish yourself as any kind of guardian figure. Are these terms acceptable? They weren't terms. They were constraints, boundaries drawn by someone who trusted neither his intentions nor his understanding of what Emma actually needed. But Marcus nodded, accepting limitations he would have rejected in any other context, because the alternative was walking away entirely, and he'd already learned that wasn't something he could do. The family room was attempting warmth through donated furniture and faded posters about emotions, but mostly it just felt institutional. A space designed for temporary connections that would leave no permanent mark. Emma sat on a worn couch, still wearing her yellow coat despite the room's adequate heating, her green backpack beside her like a companion that wouldn't disappear. She looked exactly as he remembered. Small, composed, watchful in a way that suggested she was always assessing whether the world would prove itself trustworthy. Marcus sat in the chair across from her, aware of the caseworker in the corner documenting everything, aware of how carefully he needed to navigate this conversation. "Hello, Emma. You came back," she said. Not quite a question. More an observation that carried layers he wasn't sure how to interpret. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." She tilted her head slightly, considering his statement with the same measured patience she'd shown on the street. Adults say that when they mean they want to feel okay about leaving. The accuracy was devastating. Marcus felt something crack in his carefully maintained composure, some defense that had protected him from acknowledging uncomfortable truths about his own behavior. "You're right," he admitted, because lying to her felt more dishonest than lying to himself. "I do want to feel okay, but I also genuinely want to know if you're safe, if you have what you need. I need people to stop being so lonely that they forget how to stay," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of wisdom that shouldn't have belonged to someone her age. "Grown-ups are good at disguising it. They call it being busy or successful or independent. But it's just loneliness with better vocabulary." Marcus sat with her words, feeling them settle into the space where his prepared responses should have been. She'd done it again, cut through every layer of deflection and pretense to name something true and uncomfortable. He thought about his penthouse, his carefully curated life, the way he'd convinced himself that isolation was a choice rather than a consequence. "I don't know how to fix that," he said finally, offering honesty instead of solutions. "You can't fix it with money," Emma replied, not unkindly. "You have to just stay, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you don't know what to do next." The caseworker announced that their time was ending, and Marcus stood, accepting the limitation even as every instinct urged him to negotiate for more. Emma watched him prepare to leave, and for a moment he thought she might say something else, might offer another observation that would rearrange his understanding of himself. Instead, she simply nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that he'd shown up, that he'd listened, that maybe, just maybe, he was learning what staying actually required. The inconsistencies began accumulating like small stones in Marcus's pocket, individually negligible, collectively impossible to ignore. Emma knew that his building had a service and trance that residents rarely used. She could describe the rhythm of late-night board meetings, the particular exhaustion that followed negotiations designed to look effortless. She understood that expensive suits wrinkled differently than cheaper ones, that leather interiors in cars had a specific smell, that people with money moved through the world with a certain kind of deliberate invisibility. Yet she couldn't or wouldn't provide an address, couldn't remember her parents' phone numbers or their names beyond mom and dad, couldn't describe her school or her neighborhood or any of the mundane details that should have been automatic for a child her age. The fragments she offered were curiously sophisticated, observational rather than experiential, as if she'd learned about wealthy routines from watching rather than living them. Marcus sat in his office reviewing notes from Diane's latest update, the words blurring together as his mind tried to construct explanations that would make the pieces fit. Outside his window, the city stretched in every direction, full of stories he would never know and connections he would never understand. His phone buzzed with the fourth call from Patricia in an hour, and he knew before answering what conversation was waiting for him. She arrived at his office 10 minutes later, bypassing his assistant with the authority of someone who'd earned unrestricted access through years of protecting him from his own impulses. She closed the door with more force than necessary and positioned herself across from his desk with the posture of someone preparing for battle. "We need to talk about Emma," she said, dispensing with preamble. "And more specifically, we need to talk about why you're still involved with Emma." Marcus leaned back in his chair, recognizing the tone that preceded interventions he wouldn't enjoy. "I'm following the process Diane outlined. Supervised visits. No inappropriate involvement. Everything by the book." "The book doesn't account for what's happening in the margins, Marcus. I've had 3 separate journalists contact me asking about your relationship with an unidentified minor. I've had board members express concern about potential scandal. And I've had conversations with people who are asking questions you're not going to like." Something cold settled in Marcus's chest. "What kind of questions?" Patricia pulled out her tablet, scrolling to notes she'd clearly prepared for this exact conversation. "Emma knows things about you. Specific things. Your schedule, your habits, details that aren't publicly available. One of our security consultants flagged it. He's suggesting the possibility that she was coached, that her presence on that street wasn't accidental, that you were targeted by someone who understands your patterns and knew you'd respond exactly as you did." The words hung between them like an accusation, transforming every interaction Marcus had replayed in his mind into something calculated and sinister. He thought about Emma's composure, her unusual observations, the way she'd seemed to assess him before speaking. What if Patricia was right? What if the entire encounter had been staged by someone seeking leverage or publicity or some complicated form of extortion that hadn't revealed its endgame yet? "She's a child," Marcus said, but even as he spoke, doubt crept into the certainty. "She's a child who asked if you were lost too, Marcus. That's not typical vocabulary for a 7-year-old. That's something designed to resonate with someone who's been publicly characterized as isolated and reclusive. Someone did their homework, and they knew exactly what question would get under your skin." Marcus stood, moving to the window where the city's geometry provided false order to the chaos below. He wanted to reject Patricia's theory entirely, to defend Emma's sincerity and dismiss the suggestion that he'd been manipulated. But he'd built a fortune on recognizing patterns and identifying risks, and he couldn't ignore that the inconsistencies formed a shape that suggested design rather than coincidence. "What are you recommending?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Disengage. Completely. Let the system handle whatever her situation actually is. Protect yourself and the company from association with something that could be weaponized against you. It's not cruel, Marcus. It's pragmatic. If she genuinely needs help, she'll receive it through appropriate channels. If this is something else, you'll have avoided entanglement in whatever scheme is being constructed." The recommendation made perfect sense. It aligned with every principle of risk management Marcus had ever implemented. It protected his reputation, his business, his carefully constructed life from potential contamination. It was exactly what any reasonable advisor would suggest to any reasonable client facing similar circumstances. But Emma's face kept appearing in his mind. Not the calculating manipulator Patricia was describing, but the small girl in a yellow coat who'd watched adults argue around her with resigned patience, who'd spoken about loneliness with the kind of understanding that came from intimate familiarity, who'd chosen to trust him when she had every reason not to trust anyone. "I want a thorough investigation," Marcus said finally, turning from the window to face Patricia. "Private, discreet, focused on facts rather than assumptions. I want to know if there's any evidence of coaching or targeting beyond the coincidences we've identified. I want surveillance footage from that night reviewed. I want her story verified to whatever extent possible." Patricia nodded, already making notes. "And while this investigation proceeds, I maintain scheduled visits as approved by Diane." I don't withdraw emotional steadiness based on paranoia that may be unfounded. I trust process, both the child welfare system and our security protocols, to reveal truth without abandoning someone who may genuinely need consistency. That's a risk, Marcus. Everything worth doing is. He returned to his desk, feeling the weight of the decision settling into his shoulders. I've spent my career calculating risks and optimizing outcomes. But some things can't be reduced to probability assessments and mitigation strategies. If I'm wrong about her, the investigation will reveal it. If I'm wrong about myself, about my capacity to stay present when it's uncomfortable, then I'll have learned something more valuable than protection. Patricia studied him with an expression that mixed concern and something closer to respect. You're different since that night. I'm not entirely sure it's an improvement. Marcus thought about his penthouse, his carefully maintained isolation, the way he'd convinced himself that distance was strength rather than fear. Neither am I, he admitted. But I'm more sure of this than I've been of anything in years. After Patricia left, Marcus sat alone in his office as afternoon light angled through the windows, painting geometric shadows across his desk. He pulled up the security consultant's report, reading through the flagged inconsistencies with fresh eyes, trying to see Emma as a threat rather than a child. The evidence could support both interpretations, sophisticated knowledge suggesting calculation, or sophisticated observation suggesting unusual intelligence shaped by circumstances he didn't yet understand. He chose to believe the latter while investigating the former, accepting the vulnerability that came with trust while maintaining the vigilance that came with experience. It wasn't faith exactly. It was something more complicated, the decision to stay present in uncertainty, to let truth reveal itself gradually rather than constructing protective narratives based on fear. Emma had asked if he was lost too. Maybe the answer wasn't about geography or direction. Maybe it was about having the courage to remain uncertain while still moving forward. The foster home sat in a neighborhood Marcus's GPS had to recalculate twice. A modest single-story house with a chain-link fence and a front yard that had surrendered to practical neglect years ago. Children's bikes leaned against the porch railing, their paint chipped and faded in a way that spoke of use rather than abandonment. Marcus parked on the street, aware of how his car stood out among the aging sedans and minivans that lined the curb, aware of how his presence might be interpreted by neighbors who'd learned to be suspicious of unfamiliar wealth in familiar spaces. Linda Garrett answered the door with a toddler on her hip and the kind of exhaustion that had become permanent enough to stop commenting on. She was in her 50s, round-faced and warm in the way people became when they'd chosen a vocation that guaranteed emotional labor without adequate compensation. She'd been fostering for 17 years, she told Marcus during their first meeting, and had learned early that the children who appeared most composed were often carrying the heaviest weight. Emma's in the back with the homework crew, Linda said, gesturing Marcus inside with the casual authority of someone too busy to waste time on formality. Fair warning, it's chaos in there. 3 kids doing math, 2 practicing spelling, 1 having what we're diplomatically calling a processing moment about sharing crayons. The living room confirmed her description. Organized chaos held together by Linda's presence and the unspoken understanding that this house operated on rules designed for survival rather than perfection. Emma sat at the dining table surrounded by other children, a workbook open in front of her. Her yellow coat finally retired in favor of a borrowed sweater that was slightly too large. She looked up when Marcus entered, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but a softening that suggested his presence registered as familiar rather than threatening. He'd been coming twice a week for a month now, approved visits that had stretched from 15 minutes to an hour as Diane reluctantly acknowledged his consistency. He never brought gifts, had learned that lesson after watching Emma's discomfort when he'd arrived with an expensive educational tablet that had felt generous in concept but controlling in execution. Instead, he brought presence. Awkward, uncertain, increasingly genuine presence that didn't know what to do with itself but kept showing up anyway. Marcus sat across from Emma, aware of the other children watching with the frank curiosity of people who recognized when something unusual was happening in their carefully calibrated ecosystem. "What are you working on?" he asked, the question feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. "Fractions," Emma said. her voice carrying the particular frustration of someone encountering a concept that refused to cooperate with logic. They keep changing into different numbers, but they're supposed to stay the same. Marcus looked at the workbook, at the partially completed problems that suggested Emma understood the mechanics without trusting the underlying principle. They are the same, he explained, pulling the workbook closer. Just wearing different clothes. 3/6 and 1/2 are the same amount, just described differently. He worked through several problems with her, aware of Linda moving through the room managing minor crises and major meltdowns with equal efficiency, aware of how foreign this felt compared to the board meetings and strategy sessions that typically filled his evenings. There was no agenda here, no clear outcome to optimize toward. Just the slow repetition of showing up, explaining fractions, being present without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement. The following week, Marcus met with Emma's caseworker, not Diane, who'd been reassigned to emergency placements, but a younger woman named Alicia Chun who managed her caseload with the systematic efficiency of someone trying to prevent the system's failures through sheer organizational competence. She met Marcus at a coffee shop near the agency, her laptop open to files that reduced Emma's complexity to bureaucratic categories and assessment scores. She's doing well academically, Alicia reported, scrolling through reports from Emma's temporary school placement. Her teacher notes unusual emotional intelligence for her age group. She's often the one mediating conflicts between other students, helping them articulate feelings they don't have vocabulary for yet. Marcus thought about Emma's observations during their first meeting, the way she'd named his loneliness before he'd been willing to acknowledge it himself. Has her teacher identified any concerns? Alicia's expression shifted slightly, revealing the complication beneath the positive summary. Emma tests relationships. She'll engage, build trust, then deliberately create situations to see if adults will stay when things become difficult. Last week she knocked over another student's art project and refused to apologize, then watched to see if her teacher would send her away or work through the conflict. It's a pattern her teacher recognizes from other children with unstable attachment histories. The information settled uncomfortably in Marcus's chest. He thought about his own patterns, the way he'd maintained distance through efficiency, the way he'd convinced himself that isolation was protection rather than avoidance. What does she need? Consistency, Alicia said simply. Not grand gestures or promises about the future. Just people who show up repeatedly, who stay present through the testing, who demonstrate through repetition that they're not going to disappear when she becomes inconvenient. Marcus found himself thinking about that conversation during his next visit to Linda's house, watching Emma interact with the other foster children with a careful balance of engagement and self-protection. She'd share toys but not personal information. She'd help younger children with homework but deflect questions about her own history. She existed in a state of provisional trust, constantly assessing whether the world would prove itself worthy of deeper investment. During their supervised time together, Emma asked him about his work with the same observational curiosity she applied to everything. Marcus found himself describing board meetings and negotiations with unusual honesty, admitting when he felt uncertain, acknowledging when solutions felt inadequate. Emma listened with focused attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed how carefully she was tracking not just his words but the emotions underneath them. "Do you ever want to just stop going?" she asked during one conversation, her eyes fixed on the origami crane she was folding from paper Linda had provided. "To all those meetings where people pretend to agree but don't really?" Marcus considered the question, aware that she was testing something, that his answer mattered in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But stopping feels like admitting I don't know what else to do. And that's scarier than continuing something that feels empty." Emma finished the crane and set it on the table between them. "That's what being lost means," she said quietly. "Not that you don't know where you are, that you're too scared to go somewhere different." The observation landed with the same devastating accuracy as her initial question on that dark street weeks ago. Marcus sat with it, feeling the discomfort of recognition, understanding that his loneliness hadn't been imposed by circumstances or demanded by success. It had been maintained by his own careful avoidance, by the repeated choice to prioritize control over connection, certainty over vulnerability. Emma was teaching him, he realized, not through lectures or advice, but through the slow demonstration of what it meant to stay present despite uncertainty, to keep showing up even when every pattern suggested people eventually left. She was 7 years old and carrying wisdom he'd spent decades trying to avoid learning. He folded his own crane, clumsy and imperfect beside hers, and placed it next to the one she'd made. 2 paper birds that couldn't fly but could at least sit together, occupying the same small space, bearing witness to each other's presence without requiring anything more complicated than consistency. The file arrived via encrypted email on a Tuesday morning, marked urgent by the private investigation firm Marcus had retained 6 weeks earlier. He opened it in his office with the door closed and his phone silenced, the kind of privacy he reserved for information that might require emotional processing he preferred to conduct alone. The document was thorough in the way expensive investigations always were: phone records, address histories, school enrollment gaps, witness interviews compiled into a narrative that was clinically precise and devastating in its implications. Emma's mother was named Christine Harding, 34 years old. Employment history showed a pattern of short-term positions followed by longer gaps, addresses that changed every 8 to 12 months, always moving laterally through neighborhoods where rent was negotiable and questions weren't asked. There were hospital records, emergency room visits for Emma spanning 3 years, injuries that individually looked accidental but collectively suggested inadequate supervision at minimum, deliberate harm at worst. Social services had been involved twice before, investigations that had been closed due to insufficient evidence or Christine's temporary improvement in circumstances. The last confirmed address was a weekly rental motel 6 miles from where Marcus had found Emma. Christine had checked out 9 days before their encounter, leaving no forwarding information. No missing person report had been filed. No Amber Alert issued. Emma hadn't been lost in any conventional sense. She'd been left behind, discarded like the furniture Christine apparently couldn't afford to move to wherever she'd gone next. Marcus felt rage crystallize in his chest, sharp and clean and uncomplicated. This was what he understood: clear villains, obvious failures, situations that demanded accountability and correction. Christine Harding had abandoned her daughter, had treated a child like an inconvenience rather than a responsibility. And there were laws about this, systems designed to punish exactly this kind of negligence. He could pursue charges. He could ensure consequences. He could transform his helpless anger into action that felt like justice. He reached for his phone to call his attorney, then stopped. His hand hovered over the device as something uncomfortable worked its way through the rage. A recognition that anger was performing a function beyond righteousness. Anger was simpler than grief. Anger had a target and a trajectory. Anger didn't require him to sit with the slower, more complicated sorrow of a child who'd learned early that adults were unreliable, that home was provisional, that the world would keep moving regardless of whether she could keep up. Marcus closed the file and stared at his desk, at the polished surface that reflected nothing back except his own distorted shape. He thought about Emma's composure, the way she'd stood so still on that dark street, waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that panic accomplished nothing. How long had she been alone before he'd found her? Hours? Days? Had she hoped Christine would return? Or had she already understood that this time was different, that she'd crossed some invisible threshold into permanent displacement? The meeting with Diane happened 2 days later, in her cluttered office where the files seemed to multiply between visits. She'd received the same investigative report, had already begun coordinating with law enforcement and child protective services to build a case that might eventually locate Christine and hold her accountable for abandonment. But her expression when Marcus arrived suggested she'd anticipated his presence and prepared for a conversation he wouldn't enjoy. This changes Emma's status. Diane began without preamble. She's no longer temporary placement pending family reunification. She's officially in state custody with parental rights likely to be terminated pending investigation outcomes. Marcus nodded, processing the bureaucratic language that translated to Emma becoming legally orphaned despite having a living mother somewhere. What are next steps for her placement? We'll look for long-term foster situations with potential adoption track. Given her age and history, we're optimistic about finding appropriate placement, though it may take time. Diane paused, her eyes meeting his with uncomfortable directness. I want to be clear about something, Marcus. Your involvement with Emma has been consistent and seemingly beneficial. But this investigation, this push for accountability, you need to examine whose needs that's serving. The implication landed like a challenge. You think I'm pursuing this for myself? I think you're angry at adults who failed a child, which is appropriate. But I also think you're constructing a narrative where you get to be the hero who saves her, and that's not how this works. Caring for Emma doesn't mean you own the outcome of her story. It doesn't give you the right to determine what justice looks like on her behalf. Marcus felt defensive mechanisms activate, the instinct to argue that his intentions were pure, that he genuinely wanted what was best for Emma regardless of how it reflected on him. But Diane's words had struck something true and uncomfortable, the recognition that part of him did want to orchestrate resolution, to transform this messy situation into something he could control and perfect and claim as evidence of his capacity for redemption. What does Emma need? He asked, bypassing his own complicated motivations for the simpler question of her actual requirements. Consistency, Diane said, echoing what Alicia had told him weeks earlier. Not rescue. Not a dramatic intervention that reorganizes her life according to someone else's vision. Just steady, repeated presence that demonstrates you're not going anywhere regardless of how her case resolves. When Marcus visited Linda's house that evening, Emma's withdrawal was immediately apparent. She sat apart from the other children, her homework untouched, her body language suggesting she'd retreated somewhere internal and unreachable. Linda caught his eye and shook her head slightly, a warning that whatever had shifted couldn't be fixed with conversation or distraction, that Emma had learned the investigation had intensified and understood what that meant. Marcus sat near her but not too close, respecting the boundary she'd constructed. I know they told you about the investigation, he said quietly, addressing the elephant that filled the room with suffocating presence. I know you're worried about what being found means. Emma didn't respond, but her shoulders tightened incrementally, confirming his assessment. I can't promise you outcomes, Marcus continued, choosing words with more care than any contract negotiation had ever required. I can't tell you where you'll be placed or what happens with your mother or how any of this resolves. But I can promise you this. I will be at the next scheduled visit. And the one after that. And the one after that. Not because of investigation results or legal determinations, but because I said I would show up, and I'm learning that sometimes the only thing we can control is whether we keep showing up. Emma turned slightly, not quite looking at him but acknowledging his presence. What if they send me somewhere far away? Then I'll drive farther for visits. Linda says my car can handle it. He attempted lightness, though the fear beneath her question made humor feel inadequate. What if you get tired of driving? Then I'll be tired and still driving. Emma studied him with those dark, assessing eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. You promise. Marcus thought about all the promises he'd made in business. Carefully worded, hedged with conditions, designed to provide escape routes if circumstances changed. This promise had none of those protections. It was simple and absolute and terrifying in its vulnerability. I promise, he said, and felt the weight of the words settle into his chest like stones he'd carry until he proved them true through repetition rather than declaration. Emma nodded once, then returned her attention to the homework she'd been avoiding. Not quite trust, but provisional acceptance that maybe, just maybe, this particular adult would prove different from all the ones who'd left before. The photograph was grainy and poorly framed, taken through a coffee shop window on someone's phone, but it was clear enough to identify Marcus sitting across from Emma at Linda's dining table, their heads bent over what appeared to be homework. The image had been posted to a local community forum with the caption, Millionaire Marcus Aldridge spotted with mysterious child. Adoption in the works? Within 6 hours it had been shared 4,000 times, picked up by 3 gossip blogs, and recontextualized into a dozen competing narratives that bore only passing resemblance to reality. Marcus first learned about it from Patricia, who arrived at his office at 7 in the morning with her laptop open to a media monitoring dashboard that showed his name trending across multiple platforms. The stories had already diverged into familiar archetypes. The redemption narrative about a lonely billionaire finding purpose through fostering, the suspicious narrative questioning why a single man was spending time with an unrelated child, and the cynical narrative suggesting the entire situation was manufactured PR designed to soften his public image before a controversial business deal. "We need a statement," Patricia said without preamble, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that silence would be interpreted as guilt regardless of actual innocence. "Something that controls the narrative before it metastasizes into something we can't manage. I've drafted 3 options. One emphasizes civic duty. One focuses on supporting the foster system generally. One redirects to your existing charitable work without confirming specifics." Marcus scrolled through the coverage, watching his life with Emma reduced to content optimized for engagement and moral certainty. The comments sections were predictably vicious, people who'd never met him or Emma constructing elaborate theories about his motivations, his character, his worthiness to be involved in a child's life. Some defended him with the same aggressive certainty as those who condemned him, turning a complicated situation into a proxy battle for larger cultural anxieties about wealth and power and who deserve trust in spaces involving children. His lawyers arrived an hour later with the opposite recommendation. Complete silence, no confirmation, no denial, allowing the story to burn through its natural life cycle while maintaining legal distance from anything that could be weaponized in future litigation. They presented case studies of similar situations where public statements had extended media attention rather than containing it, where every clarification had generated additional questions that transformed private matters into prolonged public entertainment. Marcus sat through both presentations aware that neither approach centered Emma's needs or dignity. Patricia's statements would confirm her existence and relationship to him, transforming her into a public figure whose story would be dissected by strangers with opinions and no accountability. His lawyer's silence would allow speculation to flourish unchecked, creating narratives she might encounter years later when searching her own name online. Both strategies prioritized his protection over hers, which was standard practice in crisis management but felt increasingly unconscionable the longer he considered it. Diane called mid-morning, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I've had 6 media requests for comment about Emma in the last 2 hours. Our agency policy is absolute non-disclosure of minor information, but that hasn't stopped reporters from camping outside Linda's house trying to get photographs. Emma is terrified, Marcus. She thinks being in the news means her mother will find her, and that being found means going back to instability." The information landed like a physical blow. Marcus had been so focused on managing the narrative's impact on his reputation that he hadn't fully considered how it was affecting Emma in real time. The confusion, the fear, the violation of having strangers discuss her life as if it were public property available for consumption and judgment. "What does she need?" Marcus asked, the question becoming his default whenever his own impulses threatened to override what actually mattered. "She needs this to stop," Diane said bluntly. "She needs the adults in her life to prioritize her safety over their own agendas. And she needs you to decide whether you're in this because you genuinely care about her well-being or because it makes you feel better about yourself." After Diane hung up, Marcus sat alone in his office looking at the photograph that had started this cascade. It was actually a nice image. Emma concentrating on fractions, Marcus explaining something with his hands, both of them existing in a moment of ordinary connection that had nothing to do with money or status or any of the narratives being constructed around them. But the moment had been stolen, transformed into content, stripped of context and dignity in service of strangers' entertainment. Patricia was waiting for his decision, her laptop open to the draft statements that would allow him to shape perception and protect his company from association with controversy. His lawyers were prepared to enforce the strategic silence that would maintain deniability while the story eventually moved on to easier targets. Both approaches were professionally sound, battle-tested, designed to minimize damage to his reputation and business interests. Marcus chose neither. "No statement," he told Patricia. "No confirmation, no denial, no redirection. But also, I'm stepping back from any public association with Emma's case. No more visits at Linda's house where neighbors can photograph through windows. No more discussions with caseworkers in coffee shops. Everything moves to private, secured locations or doesn't happen at all." Patricia's expression showed confusion mixed with frustration. "That doesn't control the narrative, Marcus. That just lets other people write whatever story they want without challenge." "I know." He closed his laptop, severing the connection to the media dashboard and its real-time measurement of his reputation's fluctuation. But Emma isn't a story. She's a person who's already been abandoned once and doesn't deserve to have her life turned into public spectacle because I didn't protect her privacy carefully enough. If stepping back costs me control over the narrative, that's my consequence to bear, not hers. This could damage the company. Board members are already asking questions. Investors get nervous about controversy involving children, regardless of actual circumstances. Then I'll handle the board and the investors. Marcus met Patricia's eyes, aware that he was making a decision she couldn't support professionally even if she understood it personally. I've spent my career optimizing outcomes and managing perception. But I can't manage my way out of this without using Emma as a tool in that management, and I won't do that. Some things matter more than reputation. The words felt foreign in his mouth, contradicting decades of carefully cultivated priorities. But they also felt true in a way that board presentations and shareholder letters never had, authentic rather than strategic, chosen rather than calculated. When Marcus visited Emma 3 days later in a private room at the Child Welfare Agency, no windows, no neighbors, no possibility of cameras. She was quieter than usual, her body language suggesting she'd retreated somewhere internal for protection. But when he sat down across from her, she studied his face with the same assessing intensity she'd shown that first night on the dark street. "You're in trouble because of me," she said, not quite a question. "I'm in a situation because of choices I made," Marcus corrected gently. "That's different from being in trouble. And it's definitely not because of you." Emma absorbed this, turning it over with visible consideration. The other foster kids saw the pictures online. They said you must be crazy to mess up your life for some kid you barely know. Marcus thought about his pristine reputation, his carefully constructed public image, the control he'd surrendered by choosing Emma's dignity over his own narrative management. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "But I'd rather be the kind of crazy that keeps promises than the kind of smart that protects itself by abandoning people." Something shifted in Emma's expression, not quite trust, but a recalibration of possibility. She'd spent her life watching adults choose themselves when complications arose, watching people optimize their own comfort at her expense. Marcus's decision to take a loss he couldn't buy his way out of contradicted everything her experience had taught her to expect. She didn't say anything else, but she moved slightly closer, allowing the distance between them to shrink incrementally. And when Marcus pulled out the math homework Linda had sent along, Emma engaged with focus and questions, no longer testing whether he would disappear when things became difficult, but beginning to believe, cautiously, provisionally, that maybe this particular adult meant what he said. The decision point arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, announced through bureaucratic language that translated to simple reality. Emma needed permanent placement, and the state was running out of temporary solutions. Diane called Marcus to her office for what she described as an exploratory conversation about potential long-term involvement, which he understood meant she was assessing whether his months of consistent presence translated to genuine capacity for guardianship or simply persistent guilt seeking resolution. Marcus arrived prepared with documentation his lawyers had assembled, financial statements proving his ability to provide materially, background checks confirming his clean record, references from business associates attesting to his character and stability. He'd assumed, without quite articulating the assumption, that his resources would smooth the path toward whatever formal arrangement would allow him to continue being part of Emma's life. Money had always functioned this way, not buying outcomes directly, but creating conditions where outcomes became inevitable. Diane reviewed his materials with the efficiency of someone who'd seen similar presentations before and remained unimpressed by zeros on bank statements. When she finished, she closed the folder and met his eyes with an expression that suggested the real conversation was just beginning. "Becoming a licensed foster parent in this state requires 40 hours of pre-service training," she said, pulling out a different folder that was notably thicker than the one containing his financial documentation. "This covers child development, trauma-informed care, behavioral management, cultural competency, and working with the child welfare system. You'll need to complete home studies, multiple visits where evaluators assess whether your living environment is safe and appropriate for a child. You'll undergo psychological evaluation to assess emotional readiness. You'll need to provide references who can speak to your capacity for nurturing, not your business acumen. And you'll need to demonstrate that you can commit time, not money, not resources, but actual physical presence, to parenting responsibilities that don't align with executive schedules. Marcus absorbed the requirements, feeling something uncomfortable shift in his understanding of what he'd been proposing. He'd conceptualized guardianship as a legal arrangement he could manage around his existing life. Scheduled visits expanded to living arrangements, professional care staff handling daily logistics, his involvement calibrated to fit between board meetings and business travel. The framework Diane was describing allowed for none of that flexibility. It required him to reorganize his life around Emma's needs, rather than incorporating her into the margins of his priorities. "I can clear my schedule," he said, hearing the defensiveness in his tone. "I can make time." "It's not about clearing your schedule, Marcus. It's about fundamentally restructuring how you live. Emma needs a parent, not a wealthy benefactor who shows up between obligations. She needs someone who understands that childhood happens in ordinary moments, homework and dinner and bedtime routines, not in grand gestures or optimized quality time. Can you be that person?" The question hung between them, challenging not his resources but his fundamental capacity for the kind of sustained, unglamorous presence that parenting required. Marcus thought about his penthouse with its minimalist perfection and complete lack of child-appropriate anything. He thought about his 70-hour work weeks, his international travel, his carefully constructed life that had been designed specifically to avoid the complications and compromises that came with caring for another human being. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty feeling more vulnerable than any business negotiation he'd ever navigated. "But I want to try. I want to learn how to be that person, even if I'm not there yet." Diane studied him for a long moment, then opened the thick folder and pulled out application materials. "Then we start with training. Next session begins in 2 weeks. Evening classes, 4 hours per session, 10 weeks total. You'll be in a room with prospective foster parents from every background imaginable, most of whom have far less money than you and far more practical experience with the kind of challenges Emma represents. I need you to show up ready to listen rather than lead, to learn from people whose lives look nothing like yours." Marcus took the application, feeling the weight of what he was agreeing to, not financial commitment, which was easy, but the deeper commitment of allowing his certainty to be challenged by people he would typically never encounter in his carefully curated circles. The training sessions were humbling in exactly the ways Diane had predicted. He sat in a community center classroom with foster parents who worked multiple jobs, who already had children and were making room for more, who understood instinctively things Marcus had to learn through explicit instruction. They taught him about regulatory compliance and safety protocols, but more importantly they taught him about patience and flexibility and the thousand small ways that trauma manifested in children who'd learned the world was unreliable. The home evaluation process was worse. A caseworker named Robert Chen arrived at Marcus's penthouse with a checklist and immediately identified problems Marcus had never considered. The glass coffee table was a head injury waiting to happen. The balcony railing spacing didn't meet safety codes for children under 10. The kitchen lacked child-proof locks on cabinets containing cleaning supplies. The minimalist aesthetic that Marcus found calming read to Robert as sterile and unwelcoming. Nowhere for a child to make mess, to claim space, to exist without fear of disrupting carefully maintained order. "A home for a child needs to feel lived in," Robert explained, making notes that suggested Marcus's current environment failed multiple criteria. "It needs space for play, for homework spread across tables, for art projects that might stain countertops. Emma needs to know she can exist here without constantly managing herself to fit your aesthetic preferences." Marcus hired contractors not to make his penthouse child-safe, but to transform it entirely. He converted his home office into a bedroom painted in colors Emma had mentioned liking during one of their conversations. He replaced the glass coffee table with something wooden and rounded. He filled the space with the kind of ordinary clutter that suggested people actually lived there, books and games and art supplies that invited use rather than preservation. He reduced his work hours from 70 to 45, then to 40, learning to delegate responsibilities he'd previously insisted on controlling personally. He hired not household staff, but a family counselor recommended by Diane who could help him navigate the emotional complexities he had no framework for managing. The psychological evaluation was perhaps the most difficult requirement, Hours of questions designed to assess not his intelligence or competence, but his emotional availability and capacity for vulnerability. The psychologist asked about his own childhood, his relationship patterns, his understanding of attachment, and his willingness to seek help when situations exceeded his expertise. Marcus found himself discussing loneliness and isolation and the ways he'd convinced himself that independence was strength rather than protection against the pain of connection. When Emma visited the transformed penthouse for the first time, a supervised visit that would determine whether the space felt appropriate for potential placement, she moved through the rooms slowly, touching things carefully as if testing whether she was allowed. She stopped in the bedroom that had been prepared for her, looking at the bookshelf filled with age-appropriate titles, the desk positioned near the window, the stuffed animals that suggested someone had tried to imagine what a 7-year-old might want even if they'd gotten some details wrong. "Is this for me?" she asked, her voice small in the large space. "If you want it to be," Marcus said carefully, aware that Diane was watching from the doorway, assessing his response. "Nothing is decided yet, but I wanted you to see that there's space for you here, that you wouldn't be disrupting anything, because this was made for you." Emma sat on the bed, then lay back, staring at the ceiling where Marcus had installed stars that would glow in the dark. A detail the contractor had suggested and Marcus had initially dismissed as unnecessarily whimsical before realizing that childhood should have room for whimsy. She laughed softly, the sound unexpected and precious, the first time Marcus had heard genuine joy from her rather than careful composure. "I've never had glow stars before," she said, still looking up at them. "My mom always said they were stupid and would fall down and make a mess." Marcus sat in the desk chair, giving her space while remaining present. "Well, if they fall down, we'll put them back up. That's what tape is for." Emma rolled onto her side, looking at him with an expression that held the beginning of something Marcus didn't quite know how to name. Not quite trust yet, but maybe the possibility of trust, the tentative belief that this space, this person, might actually be safe enough to start relaxing into. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't need to. The small laugh, the way she'd allowed herself to lie down without asking permission first, the fact that she was imagining what those stars would look like in the darkness. These were signals that something fundamental was beginning to shift. Diane made notes, her expression professionally neutral, but when she caught Marcus's eye there was something there that might have been approval, or at least acknowledgement that he was learning, however slowly, how to offer not just resources but the kind of ordinary, steady presence that could become home. The paperwork was finalized on a cold morning in January, for months after Marcus had first encountered Emma on a street he'd chosen specifically to avoid being seen. The arrangement was less dramatic than anyone outside the system might have imagined. Marcus would serve as Emma's legal guardian under state supervision, with ongoing caseworker visits, mandatory counseling sessions, and regular reviews to ensure placement remained appropriate. It wasn't adoption, which would have required terminating parental rights that were still technically active despite Christine's continued absence. It wasn't foster care in the traditional sense, which implied temporary arrangement pending family reunification. It was something more complicated and honest. A commitment to provide stability while acknowledging that Emma's story included chapters that existed before him and would continue in ways he couldn't control or predict. Diane had been clear about the boundaries when presenting the final recommendation to the placement committee. Marcus wasn't rescuing Emma. He was accepting responsibility for being part of her support system, one component in a larger network that included therapists, teachers, caseworkers, and the foster community that had held her during the months of uncertainty. His wealth mattered less than his demonstrated capacity to show up repeatedly, to accept correction when he made mistakes, to prioritize Emma's needs over his own comfort or convenience. Emma moved into the transformed penthouse on a Saturday, carrying the same green backpack she'd worn that first night and a donated suitcase containing the accumulated possessions of her 7 years. Clothes that mostly fit, school assignments, the origami cranes they'd made together during supervised visits, a stuffed rabbit Linda had given her as a going-away gift. The material evidence of her life fit easily in the bedroom Marcus had prepared, leaving vast empty space that would either be filled gradually with the accumulation of childhood or would remain a reminder of everything she'd lost before arriving here. Marcus had expected the transition to feel momentous, transformative in the way business deals felt when years of negotiation finally culminated in signatures and champagne. Instead, it felt ordinary and slightly awkward, Two people who knew each other but were still learning how to exist in the same domestic space. Navigating questions about bathroom schedules and breakfast preferences and the thousand small negotiations that constituted shared living. Emma was quiet that first week, not withdrawn exactly, but carefully observant, still assessing whether this arrangement would prove stable or reveal itself as another temporary situation she'd need to adapt to and eventually leave. She asked permission before touching things, cleaned up meticulously after herself, managed her presence with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned that taking up too much space led to complications. Marcus found himself wishing she would make a mess, would claim territory more aggressively, would demonstrate through disorder that she felt secure enough to stop managing herself so precisely. The breakthrough came during a Thursday evening 2 weeks after her arrival, when Emma was struggling with a science project about ecosystems that required building a diorama. She'd been working at the kitchen table for an hour, her frustration mounting as the cardboard refused to cooperate and the glue created sticky disasters instead of secure attachments. Marcus had been trying to help while also preparing dinner, a new skill he was developing with mixed success, when Emma finally threw down the scissors with more force than she probably intended. "This is stupid," she said, her voice tight with frustration that clearly extended beyond the immediate craft project. "Nothing stays where it's supposed to. Everything keeps falling apart." Marcus turned from the stove where he was burning what was meant to be stir-fry and looked at Emma. Really looked at her, seeing not the composed child who'd learned to manage adult expectations, but the 7-year-old who was exhausted from years of instability and terrified that this new arrangement would collapse like everything else she tried to build. He turned off the burner, crossed to the table, and sat down across from her amid the wreckage of cardboard and glue and frustrated ambition. "You're right," he said simply. "Things fall apart. I can't promise this won't." Emma looked up, surprised by the admission rather than reassurance. "But here's what I can promise," Marcus continued, picking up one of the fallen cardboard trees and attempting to reattach it with more glue. "When things fall apart, we'll put them back together. And when they fall apart again, because they probably will, we'll put them together again. That's not failure. That's just what building something looks like." Emma watched him work for a moment, then picked up her own piece of the diorama and started reconstructing with less precision but more acceptance of imperfection. They worked in silence, punctuated by occasional instructions and shared observations about the difficulty of making miniature trees stand upright. The dinner burned completely, filling the apartment with smoke that triggered alarms Marcus had to disable while Emma laughed. Actually laughed, unself-consciously and without checking first whether her amusement was appropriate. They ordered pizza instead, eating it among the craft supplies still scattered across the kitchen table. And Marcus realized this was what Diane had meant about ordinary moments mattering more than grand gestures. This was parenting, not the optimized, Instagram-worthy version he'd vaguely imagined, but the messy, improvised reality of sitting with frustration and burned dinners and projects that refused to cooperate. This was showing up not just during crises, but during the mundane struggles that constituted most of life. The loneliness that had defined Marcus for years didn't disappear. He still felt it some mornings when he woke up uncertain whether he was adequate to the responsibility he'd accepted, still experienced it during moments when Emma withdrew into herself and he didn't know how to reach her, still carried it as a familiar companion that had simply learned to coexist with connection rather than demanding absolute isolation. But the loneliness had changed shape, less like a prison he'd constructed and more like a truth he could acknowledge while still choosing to stay present with another person who was learning to do the same thing. Emma fell asleep that night under her glow-in-the-dark stars, her science project still incomplete on the kitchen table, her defenses fractionally lowered in the way that suggested she was beginning to believe this place might actually hold her without requiring constant self-management in return. Marcus stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her breathe with the particular vulnerability of sleep, understanding that he hadn't rescued her from loneliness because loneliness wasn't something that could be rescued away. He'd simply offered to share the weight of it, to demonstrate that being found wasn't about erasing difficult histories, but about showing up consistently enough that trust could grow in the spaces between arrival and departure. He returned to the kitchen and finished cleaning up the craft supplies, leaving the half-completed diorama on the counter where they could work on it again tomorrow. Small commitments rather than dramatic turning points. Presence rather than perfection. The quiet, unglamorous work of building something that might actually last. Not because it was perfect, but because when it fell apart, they would put it back together and keep going.